Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm talking about some great but often forgotten bands and albums of the 90s. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you go check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlists we put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoy the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So I think the 90s were a really interesting decade for music. In my opinion, it's probably the most diverse decade. There's so many different genres that got huge and popular during the 90s and released all these iconic albums that I feel like a lot of music kind of got pushed to the side and quickly forgotten. All these albums were big when they first were released, and these bands had a lot of success throughout the 90s. But now, 20 plus years later, I feel like a lot of them have been either kind of overlooked or largely forgotten. So the first album was one that I kind of consider like a mid-90s alternative classic, an album that got a lot of radio play, a lot of airplay on MTV when it was first released, and then their album after that actually was kind of big also, but kind of from there they were kind of largely forgotten. But the album is Rotting Pinata by Sponge. I came across Sponge so in the early 90s, there was a TV program that they'd play in our homeroom, beginning of high school there. It was called Channel 1. Actually, Anderson Cooper got his big break on Channel 1 also. But one day they had Sponge on there. They played the video for Plowed, I think it was. And right away, I fell in love with the song, fell in love with the album. Went out that day, bought it on cassette, and I've listened to it pretty regularly since then. Actually, now it almost 30 years now, but it's a great album. The album that came out after this, which was Wax Ecstatic, it's also a great album. And Wax Ecstatic didn't have quite the success that Rotting Pinata did, but overall, I think it's a really great album. Just not quite up to the same notch that Rotting Pinata is. The next one is probably the least forgotten on this list. That is the self-titled album from Candlebox. Came out back in 1993, a huge album when it came out. And I remember it was Woodstock in '94. I remember seeing them there on pay-per-view back in the day. But the interesting thing is about this album. First off, Candlebox, it's still going today. They've released 7 albums, 7 studio albums over the years. But their album that came out in 1990, I think it was 1998, 1999, called Happy Pills, I think overall is probably a better album than their debut. So if you guys have been watching the channel for a while, you know I'm a big punk fan. I have been since the early part of the 90s. This next album is one that I consider probably the most underrated punk album of the 90s. It's a great album released back in 1998. It is the self-titled debut album of the band Living End. So Living End formed back in 1994 in Australia. This album from beginning to end, this is one of those punk albums where I don't think there's a bad track on here. Yes, I know I'll probably get some hate from some punk fans out there that, they're on the kind of the poppier end of punk music. That's kind of where punk was in the late part of the 90s. The Living End, I think Roll On was the album that came out after this, which I thought was an okay album. They released 7 albums across their career. The first album, definitely, at least in my opinion, is hands down their best. Roll On is okay. Haven't been a huge fan of anything that they've released since then, though. So I guess I might get a little bit of pushback about this next one because here in the U.S., they've been forgotten about. They've largely been forgotten about. This album has been really kind of overshadowed, I think, over the last couple of decades. Outside the U.S., I think they've got a bigger fan base. They're probably still more popular today. Actually, I know they're still more popular because they were just Record Store Day ambassadors for Canada here a couple months ago. But the band is Our Lady Peace. My favorite album of theirs is Clumsy. Even though Gravity, which came out in 2005, I think is probably their second best album, just behind Clumsy. Both of them are great albums, but I think beginning to end, Clumsy is probably a better album. I remember when this first came out back in 1997, it was like, I remember the song Superman's Dead was on the radio. It seemed like every hour that song was played, and it's a song that has probably been so overplayed over the years. I'm kind of tired of that one song, but there's so many other great tracks on this album that I think are equally, if not maybe a little better than that one track that everyone knows. The next one is a band that I was really surprised how prolific they've been over their career. The band is Eels. My favorite album of theirs is their debut. This is Beautiful Freak, came out back in 1996, but since 1996, or since this album, they've released 14 studio albums total, 7 of which have charted in the Billboard 200 here in the U.S., which I was really surprised by. I mean, I knew that their latest album came out last year, I think it was, and when that came out is when I realized that they were even still creating music. Didn't know they had released any albums after this album, but the one track on here that everyone knows is Novocaine for the Soul, which was all over the radio when this album first came out, and that was the one track I knew off of here. I used to listen to that one track a lot. I love that one track, but it wasn't until probably 7 or 8 years ago that I rediscovered this album. This album is another one of those albums where a lot of people out there probably did the same thing as me. You listen to that one track and kind of move on, and I think you miss out on a lot of other great stuff on this album. So I think the later part of the 90s was really interesting because you had so many great alternative albums that were coming out so fast. It seemed like every week there's another great album coming out. But there's also so many other genres. Like I said before, the 90s were so diverse in music, especially the later part. I think that's why a lot of these bands, a lot of these albums from the later part of the decade largely got overshadowed, have been largely forgotten about. But this next one, this is a great album. They've released 7 albums total. This one came out back in 1999, so it was the very end of the 90s. And in the beginning part of the 2000s, music kind of shifted, and we started getting more into like nu metal and things like that. And I think that's why this band was kind of largely forgotten about. A lot of great stuff from across their career, though. But their first album, this is their debut album, "A Place in the Sun" by Lit. It's a great album if you want to go back and listen to it. But Lit actually formed, I think it was like 89, I think, when Lit actually formed. They started out as a band called Razzle, and then I think they went to Stain, I think was the name there for a couple of years, and then they went to Lit, and that's kind of when their career took off. But A Place in the Sun, I'm sure a lot of you people out there know this album. But this is one of those bands where go back and check out some of the other stuff from across their career, because like I said, in the beginning part of the 2000s, music shifted. A lot of rock music was going in a lot of different directions, but Lit kind of was still doing their thing and released a lot of great music. The next one is one of the most influential rock albums of the 90s for me personally. It's an album that I loved since it first came out. I was actually in a punk band in the mid to late part of the 90s. And we kind of ripped off some of the stuff, some of the more alternative stuff that we did. We kind of ripped off from this band and from this album. But it's an album that I love. It's probably one of my top 10 or 15 albums of all time. And one that you probably know some stuff off here. They did have a couple of minor radio hits on this one. And I think it's kind of largely been forgotten about. But the album is "You Prefer an Astronaut" by Hum. Fantastic album. So this is actually classified as a shoegaze album, which I've always thought was probably one of the dumber names for a subgenre. Like, you're just like staring at shoes when you're listening to it. But it's a great album. I think "Stars" was the one track that got some radio play on here. I think this charted on the Billboard 200. Maybe not. Maybe it was just the rock charts that it was on. But anyway, great album, and one that definitely needs to be repressed. This is the SRC vinyl version that the band is supposed to be reissuing this album at some point, but hopefully it gets reissued. I will say that their album that came out after this, so this is their third album, their fourth studio album, which was called "Downward is Heavenward," almost as good as "You'd Prefer an Astronaut," but not quite there, but it is a great album in itself also. The next one I think is kind of largely looked at as a one-hit wonder band, even though I think they've done a lot of great things on other albums that they've done over their career. They've released 7 studio albums, but this is the one album that everyone remembers is a really good album. But even though there's probably one track on there that everyone knows. But the album is "All the Pain Money Can Buy" by Fastball. "The Way," which is the first track on here, it's the only song that everyone knows. But it's an album that if you go back and listen to, man, there's so many other great tracks on here. Like I said, they've released 7 albums across their career. And they're one of those bands I really encourage you out there if you're a late 90s alternative fan, go back and check out the other stuff in their career. And then the last band I've got is I think the only one on the list that isn't still making music today. But they did release 9 studio albums from 1992 until 2014. So over a 12-year span, they released a lot of music. They're really only known for their first 2 albums. Their second album was the one that really kind of made them big. Didn't really do anything, hugely successful after that, even though they had a really good career. But the band is Cracker. The album is Kerosene Hat. Low was the one track that was all over the radio that everyone knows. But I would tell you, if you know this band, know this album, and don't know their debut album, go back and check out their self-titled debut album. I think it's almost equally as good as this album. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. 10 albums that are in my collection that I think are really kind of forgotten bands, forgotten albums from the 90s, which is a decade of music I absolutely love. I know a lot of you out there feel the same way, so make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know some of the albums that you think are kind of largely forgotten that people should kind of go back and rediscover. I'm always interested to see what you guys have to say about that. But if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. And that's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.